This is Mara and Ben welcoming you to another episode of Stellar Strategy Gaming. We were going to do something about nautical D&D campaigns, but then we saw the new Suicide Squad movie, which will forever after be remembered as the good one. And we decided that instead of doing that, we were going to go ahead and build Harley Quinn to 10th level in D&D 5e. Obviously, there's more than one way you can go with this, with races, classes, backgrounds, feats, everything else. So Mara, why don't you go ahead and kick it off? Tell us what you came up with.
Alright, so I actually went with a level 4 rogue, level 6 wizard of all things, but I specifically went with the Blade Singer wizard. Because with Harley Quinn, what we see is that she has abilities which seem almost magical, but they still have a physical characteristic. Not getting into any spoilers or anything, but she uses a gun at one scene, and just the world around her is surrounded by flowers, and she seems nigh impenetrable to attack. And that seems very much like when the Blade Singer activates their ability, and their AC gets increased by their intelligence modifier, which is a pretty nasty one to have. So I figured that fit perfectly, and as for Rogue, I didn't really choose any one specific path, because depending on the movie, Harley Quinn's roguish archetype can be very different. So that's the baseline for what I've got, and then her background is noble, because we see in, I believe it's the Birds of Prey movie, that while she didn't necessarily have the noblest of backgrounds, and actually had a religious upbringing, she did become a PhD in psychology before she became Harley Quinn as we know her today. So that's why she has the noble background, because there's no doctor background, and I figure that it's the closest thing.
So an interesting little bit of trivia. Traditionally in Europe, if you gain, I believe it is a PhD, you automatically get the rank of Baron. So I hadn't thought about that until you said that just now. That makes a tremendous amount of sense. So if Harley Quinn is a wizard, I understand you're not necessarily doing the most traditional interpretation of a wizard where she's, reading from a book and casting spells. But what kind of spells do you think the wizard Harley Quinn would have and use?
Probably magical weapon spells. One of them is Holy Blade, which, again, avoiding spoilers, there is a javelin in which she uses quite heavily, which is whole thing is that it's supposed to be holy or something like that. And then on top of that, there's also Green Flame Blade, where she seems to be able to grab knives from nowhere sometimes, like in the scene where she tries to kill Batman. But, so, yeah, things like that, where it's just, okay, I have a weapon now. That seems the most like Harley Quinn. In one scene, she has no weapon. In the next, she has a fully loaded assault rifle. It's like, where did it come from? We don't really care, because it's Harley Quinn. It just makes sense for the character.
All right, and with the Blade Singer, I take it she must be some kind of elf or half-elf. Did you choose any particular race for her?
In Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, it is no longer required that they be elf, so I did go with, I actually went with Scourge Azamar, because of the very pale skin and the fact that, at least where she is now in the DCEU, she's sort of like this half-redeemed person, whereas if we had been making this for the first Suicide Squad movie, I would definitely have gone more of a Fallen Azamar route, and had we been going on some sort of like prequel thing, I might have gone proper Azamar, but as it stands, that sort of self-destructive Scourge Azamar makes a lot of sense, I feel, for how the character is now.
And then final question on your build. What made you choose that particular breakdown of 6 wizard, 4 rogue as far as the leveling?
Well, we see throughout her movies that she's moving further and farther away from the crime syndicates and such, and so even though she is still definitely committing mass murder occasionally, she isn't really doing things that we'd associate with a rogue. She's actually more acting like a fighter, but fighter definitely isn't right for Harley Quinn, and so I chose with one of the fusion classes that makes a lot of sense, which is the Blade Singer, and I made that a little higher than rogue. If we see a return to form, which would be very unfortunate, as I like where the character is going, but if we do, I'd change that to a higher rogue to wizard level, or if we were going earlier in the series, same thing.
That makes sense.
So, what is your build for the Harley Quinn character?
So I went with a 50-50 split. I went with 5 levels of rogue and I went with 5 levels of monk. For the race, I chose one that might seem a bit odd, but I will explain. I chose to make her a tabaxi. The tabaxi's movement speed bonuses, their climbing ability, and just as you mentioned, she always seems to be able to pull a weapon out of nowhere. The fact of the tabaxi having claws just seemed like a nice way to capture in-game that element of Harley Quinn where she can always pull a blade out of somewhere. So I might do it at the DM's discretion, of course. I might do it something where she's a tabaxi mechanically, but in terms of flavor, she's maybe whatever the dominant race of the area is. And for her rogue component, the 5 levels of rogue, at 5th level with rogue, you get the uncanny dodge, which that's Harley all day. She's always sort of taking hits that should kill her and somehow managing to get out of it, so it works for that.
Honestly, you could make a good case for her being an orc to get that extra 10 hit points when she dies.
Oh, the relentless endurance where she comes back at 1 hit points when she drops to 0?
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that, but it's really not a bad idea at all. It's a very defensible build. As far as the type of rogue she is, I chose the thief archetype because
oldie but a goldie.
Right, and it fits with the character. It fits with all the acrobatic stuff she does. It fits with all of her climbing abilities, and so on and so forth. Now, the monk choice I know is a little more odd, so I will briefly explain. Basically, we see her fighting with no apparent armor. Often she fights unarmed, but very effectively. And so that just made a lot of sense to go with that. And I also, there's a monk type called the Drunken Master, which, among other things, that I don't have the book in front of me, but the Drunken Master, when they're knocked prone, they're able to pop back up and only use 5 feet of movement speed rather than half their movement, as is with other classes. And when they take the attack action, if they want to, they get the benefit of a disengage. Mm-hmm. So there again, I see that with Harley Quinn's movement, and you pair that with some of the other abilities that come up, it just makes a tremendous amount of sense. And her whole personality really fits with the Drunken Master type.
True that.
Now, I did go for some feats with this build. One of them is a feat that I had never paid any attention to, and that is the Observant feat. And that feat, quick to notice the details of your environment, and you gain the following benefits. Increase your intelligence or wisdom score by 1 to a max of 20. If you can see a creature's mouth while it is speaking a language you understand, you can interpret what it's saying by reading its lips. You have +5 to your passive wisdom, perception, and passive intelligence investigation scores. Harley Quinn's background, PhD in psychology, makes perfect sense to me, and it's actually kind of a dope feat, honestly. I wish I'd noticed it before. I mean, +5 to your passive perception is, you never don't see it.
I don't think I've ever taken that feat before. I think the only intelligence-based ones I ever take these days are Keen Mind and the one which allows you to read basically every language to piss off your DM.
It's funny because there are whole videos on how Keen Mind is the worst feat there is, but you seem to use it really well. Now, in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which we did do a video about, and you should definitely go watch it and troll us more than we already have been, because when you troll us, you increase our engagement metrics, so please do that. If your DM is allowing firearms in your Dungeons & Dragons campaign, there is, and especially if your DM rules that rogues and monks aren't proficient in firearms, there's a feat called Gunner. You have a quick hand and a keen eye when employing firearms, granting you the following benefits. Increase your dex score to a max of 20, gain proficiency at firearms, ignore the loading properties of firearms, so you can actually have infinite ammo be a mechanic in the game. The book specifically does allow for it.
Nice.
And being within 5 feet of a hostile creature doesn't impose disadvantage on your ranged attack rolls. A little bit of a tangent, but I actually really do like the way they incorporated firearms into D&D. It usually doesn't go well in medieval or fantasy-based stuff. It's usually like in the god-awful World of Warcraft movie where it's we've written ourselves into a corner. Oh, I know, we'll introduce firearms so we have some way for them to fight the orcs. Or it's in, like it is in Age of Empires 2, which, as much as I love that game, the way firearms work in that game just doesn't make sense. It doesn't play well mechanically. Wizards did a great job with it. And I love the idea of Harley playing primarily as her monk type, and all of a sudden she, whips out a revolver in each hand and starts unloading on the enemy. And mechanically, because monks get extra attack at level 5, you're good to go with that.
I can imagine. I don't know if dual wielder would work with revolvers because I haven't read the firearms rules for D&D in a very long time, but I'm sure they have a bunch of weird classifications where you could make it even more perfect or overpowered depending.
I would do that strictly as a flavor thing, just strictly as since the monk gets the extra attack, shoot with one and shoot with the other. It's mechanically it would be no different than repeatedly firing one.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. And so finally, what did you say the backstory was, or background?
Harley Quinn's background, I took Acolyte because, as you say, there's no PhD in the Dungeons & Dragons universe, multiverse. I figured Acolyte would be the closest thing. If you're going to study, you're probably studying at some kind of religious institution. And prior to the advent of modern psychology, who you would have talked to about psychological issues would have been your pastor, your rabbi, your imam, whatever you have.
So whereas mine is a very literal interpretation of the character, in some ways at least, yours is much more like designed to be able to be melded into a world very well.
That's the general idea I went with. I like your design a lot, to be honest, and you did some really creative things with it. One of the things I love about doing these kinds of videos is there's so many different ways you can go with it. Like, whenever they come out with John Wick number 16, he's 90 years old and still killing everybody. We'll probably do a John Wick build, and we'll probably come up with completely different versions of John Wick, although he'll obviously have the gunner feet on both builds. But that's part of the fun of this, is that it's hard to truly get it wrong. Unless you make Harley Quinn a bard. If you make Harley Quinn a bard, you're wrong. You're just wrong. Because while that is the most obvious option, I gotta say, it just doesn't work mechanically. It's kind of an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, I could even argue that you could go Warlock more than Bard with Harley Quinn and then have the Joker literally be her patron. Also arguing in the sense of the fact that the Joker is quite harmful to Harley Quinn, and that's not a spoiler. That's been in the comics since the very beginning. And patrons tend to be at least minorly detrimental to Warlocks. That's what makes them different from clerics. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways you can go with this.
Absolutely. And yeah, if you were going to do a Let's Kill God or Let's Kill the Warlock's Patron campaign, that could be a really fun and interesting way to do it, and end up in a situation where you have a sort of a mastermind version of the Joker, like Heath Ledger's Joker, or Joker from Lego Batman being the Joker you're taking on. By the way, spoiler alert for Lego Batman, it sucks. Anyway, I think it's about time to wrap it up. Mara, do you have any closing thoughts?
Not at this moment, no. I will release a poll on the D&D Reddit asking what characters you'd like to see next for this series, though, as it does seem to be becoming a proper series given how popular it is.
I love that idea, and as always, we thank you for watching and for listening. And while we're waiting for the result on that poll, the next video we're planning on doing is going to be what makes a great game. It's going to be a little bit more philosophical, and we hope to see you on that one.